Well, it's the 1st of February 2020. We are in the Burgage, Southwell, northeast of Nottingham. I am Jason Swan-Clark. I'm interviewing Dr. Alison Milbank. So thank you for making time for this today, Alison.
It's a pleasure.
And broadly, we're going to be looking at your background, your research interests in theology and culture, and excavating with you some of your personal experiences that are behind your journey in life, ministry and theology. If I can summarise and map out your corpus of work as I've engaged with Alison, see these two distinct worlds of literature, film and music, in particular the Gothic fantasy horror, what we'll come to, and then the relationship of that with the theological and religion broadly. I understand those as your two fascinating worlds that you bring together. So I've got two guiding metaphors for our interview today. The first one is of the binocular, which I've drawn from Martin Percy. Just the simple idea that actually sometimes bringing two things together lets you see things that you actually, they work together well because they are working together, but they let you see something. So that'll be a sort of theme as we go through these two worlds of literature and religion, culture and religion. But the main route we're going to take is of map making. So as a geographical method. So that geographers, as you know, when they make different maps and then overlay them on each other, and then you see something interesting when you sort of a heat map of intensity or a location of something taking place. So those maps will be your personal interests and background, your academic worlds. We'll talk about Anglican social theology and a chapter that you wrote about F.D. Morris. And then we'll move out at the end talking about For the Parish that you wrote a few years back on ecclesiology and the condition of the church today, and finish with the implications of your work. Is that okay? So that's the journey we're going to go on. So if I could start with your childhood, could you tell me where you were born and where you grew up?
I grew up in Portsmouth, which is a northern town on the south coast, as it's often described. So it's an island, and it's quite industrial and a naval city. I grew up in an Anglican household, and from the age of 2.5 I was taken to choral matins. So I am of the generation, in fact my interest in literature I think comes from that now lost embrace of the Book of Common Prayer, the Psalms, many of which I would probably still know off by heart, the King James Version, a lost Anglicanism except at 8 o'clock communions
lost
up and down the country.
Yeah, it's fascinating because my wife, I come from a completely unchurched background. My wife comes from a strict Brethren background, through to Baptist nonconformist, her route. And she absolutely treasures that sort of catechism that she had in the Brethren church for the formation of faith. I mean, it's very, very important to her. It's lovely to... So can you tell me a bit more about that? You said lost Anglicanism, but what's it like for you personally?
Well, I'm at a cathedral where we still use the Book of Common Prayer also at one of our sung Eucharists on a Sunday. So I'm still, and we have choral evensong where the Book of Common Prayer and the Psalms and so on is still used. So although we have a huge variety of worship, and I'm just as happy taking the children and doing all age worship and sort of running up and down with balloons as I am with with the Book of Common Prayer. So don't box me into it. But my imagination, it's the materiality of the language, the beauty, the mystery of it. And then as we moved church to St Mary Portsea, which is a much more sort of high church liturgy, it kind of deepened that sense that religion is something really concrete and ordinary and part of life, but also takes you beyond yourself to encounter God. That worship did do that for me. And I always sang in choirs and so felt part of it as well, very much participatory.
unusual in this, for the format of this interview, I'm just interjecting myself a little because it prompts some of the questions. So I grew up in a completely non-Christian, very abusive background, but I had an interest, as much as I can recall as a child, in if there was a God.
Yes.
And I remember my mother had a Book of Common Prayer. She never read it, and it was kept in pristine condition. And I risked a great deal of trouble for taking it out and trying to read it, because she would never read it.
No.
And never used it, but it had to be left pristine. But I remember reading it, and again was far too young, but knew it was a doorway to something. It did something in my imagination. I couldn't receive what was in there, but that was an experience I had. So could you tell me a bit more about your relationship growing up with your parents and yourself? What was going on there in terms of your formation and imagination and faith and life? Question too broad. Is that right?
My family was an unusual one in that my mother's family were Anglo-Irish gentry. My grandfather was head of the Protestant Truth Society and chaplain general of the Orange Order at certain points in his life. So a very Protestant background in that Irish. My father his father was a newsagent. So it was a very mixed background. But my childhood was very genteel, but within a kind of working class sort of area. It was quite strange, really. Looking back, it was quite strange. And it had its own tensions, but my family were, a very good Christian family who looked after other people and gave me a great ethic. But within a Portsmouth which had a big tradition of social involvement. So although my parents didn't go to the church, I went to certain children's things at St Mark's, Portsea, which had a very inspirational Christian socialist vicar, Bill James, very famous, who did wonderful processions in the streets. Portsmouth was the Portsmouth of St Agatha's Landport, where Father Dolling had exercised a very important ministry among the poor in the 19th century. And I was very aware of this tradition growing up, and one was told a bit about it, both at St Mary's and the Holy Spirit in Southsea and the other kind of Anglo-Catholic churches where I worshipped. Very aware that St Mary Portsea had a great tradition of ministering to the working classes. A huge church built by W.H. Smith, I think, a beacon amid a very, very poor area. And Portsmouth still is a place of great social inequality.
Yeah, so can I ask you a little about, the class disparities, if I use that word, if you could unpack that, what was that like in the environs of your own home and the community? Just a little more there, because it's so rich, isn't it? I mean, but if you could unpack that a little.
It's quite complex, and my sister may see it differently. But I was aware of its complexity as a child and of expectations, and being told about the fact that I was somehow excluded from a world that my mother had known growing up in totally private education. And I spent one day a week with my grandmother. I felt a certain disjunction between the way I was being brought up to behave and talk. I sound like the Queen in 1950. This is how I was brought up, But I went to, I would have gone if I got in to the local high school, and I went to a grammar school. But obviously that was very mixed. But I was just aware of being brought up with certain kinds of ways of behaviour that didn't always fit. That was all in the world in which I found myself.
I mean, you used a word a little while ago about strange, the strangeness of the environment that you were in. It was very evocative, sounded evocative. And if I could pick up on your grandmother, because I know in my own life, my grandmother was was a doorway into a different, a sort of portal to a different world than day to day.
Yes.
Was there something that was in the strangeness that sounded very evocative when you sensed it? What was going on with your grandmother, if I could ask you?
Well, that's quite difficult, in that she didn't always adjust to life without my grandfather, but she lived on her own in a house full of wonderful things. And as a child, I would just go, and of course in those days children were left on their own to just make their own entertainment, and I would play with all these wonderful things she brought back from Venice, or, you know, there was just this whole treasure house that she lived in, and I enjoyed that very much. And I would be occasionally taken to London to other aged relatives who also lived in a wonderful house full of Turners, believe it or not. They had wonderful paintings, which I think went back to South Africa when they died. And being aware of this older world where clocks ticked, and there was silence, and there was a sort of silver sugar shakers to use over your sugar on your breakfast cereal, you know, kind of just a much older world. People always feel this with their grandparents. I think my grandson, Aubrey, probably when he comes to us, thinks that our house is this old, well, it is quite old, our house, but you know, it's another world, a slightly older generation, and you know, inherit things like barometers that you sort of use. You know, that most people would just look on the internet, and I still look on the internet. I wouldn't like you to think that I live in this, but I remember the wonder of a world that opened out geographically, that opened out historically, to which I had a kind of access.
So I can, as you're saying it, it's almost like I can picture this, the sort of stained glass. Well, no, it's beautiful. I don't want to put things on it, but
there was stained glass, yes.
There was
Victorian glass, yes.
So you're starting to see the world in this rich and colourful way. I mean, I can hear that as you're sharing that. Well, this is the last question on this section here. What was your relationship like with your parents? How were they looking into your world as your world was emerging?
My father was a lovely, gifted man who should have gone a long way. He was a brilliant mathematician, and his parents, although they had the money, wouldn't allow him to go to grammar school. He left school at 14. If he'd lived, he would probably have become a priest. He was a very gentle, charming person who died far too young of cancer. My mother, I think, suffered a certain disconnect in her life, and was sometimes quite directive, very protective. I had meningitis when I was little, and I was very ill. And I think that left her almost overprotective of me. So it was quite difficult for me to actually separate from a world where she felt that as a teenager the natural thing I would want to do would be to go to a sort of ballroom dancing thing with the over 60s. So it was quite difficult for me to separate, let's put it like that.
And it sounds like you saw the world as very colourful and exciting, and a place to explore, not just with your imagination.
But also ruinous, also quite Gothic, because Portsmouth was bombed appallingly in the war, and it didn't really finish building on the bomb sites till the 1980s. So as I grew up in a bombed city, a city that was itself trying to find its way out of its glorious naval and dockyard past, which was declining. So,
well, you've mentioned the Gothic, and that's the next thing I wanted to move on to. So, was it as crude as you were looking at that situation and you saw the Gothic and that spurred your interest in the Gothic, or did you sort of emerge with an interest in the Gothic and then realise afterwards that one had furnished the other, that interplay between them?
Well, I read very, very widely as a child. In those days, there were things called Dean's Children's Classics, which were really grown-up books, sometimes shortened slightly for children. So, I will have read the Brontes at the age of 8. We used to play Jane Eyre in the playground at my junior school. I wasn't alone. There were other children reading
What
these
parts
things.
did you play? Can you remember?
I think I was often Jane, actually. I must have been quite a bossy child, I think, to have had this. We also did Wuthering Heights, and I remember being Heathcliff. So I was reading these texts. I wouldn't have known they were Gothic, but I was a child who was easily frightened. So in that sense, texts of fear worked on me.
But obviously fascinated with them. You were intrigued by them, even though you were...
Though I was easily afraid. We had a very beautiful picture book, which I gather was now unbelievably valuable, from World War I, with illustrations by, I can't remember his name now, but a very famous illustrator. And there was one, I think from the Arabian Nights, that I was so frightened that I destroyed it. So it was behind tissue paper. It was a very...
So it was veiled. You had to...
It was veiled, and I had to unveil each of the pictures in this book. And this one, for a long time, I just went past it, and then at some point I tore it out and destroyed it. So there's my Gothic childhood.
Childhood. Ah. Well, can I ask you then about the Gothic? Could you give us a definition, your definition of the Gothic, and how and why it attracts you and fascinates you? We've already started down that route, but...
Well, I work in the field of the Gothic novel, which as a term self-describes certain texts which were produced in the 18th century and later. And in that context, they're texts that evoke fear through characters who are incarcerated, and they are narratives of escape. And that escape is both spatial but also temporal. So you're escaping from ancient institutions, particularly monastic ones, or a kind of usurping political power. They're often heroines who escape. Sometimes they're texts in which people transgress certain boundaries. But I think a true Gothic novel always has this, what we might call diachronic, this temporal dimension of escaping from the past. Though I also argue that the heroine is always the true heir of these past institutions in some way. So these institutions are, in a sense, not completely taken away, but sort of purged in some way.
And what's the function of the heroine in that role and that dynamic?
She is an uncoverer of truth. She is a bearer of tradition, and she represents freedom of the future. So she has quite a privileged role.
So it's the heroine gets to bear tradition as well as uncover.
Yes, as I said, she usually inherits the house, sometimes in which she was incarcerated, as in The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. Not all tales form, but the classic Gothic novel of the 18th and early 19th century, that's the model. And in a sense, it works in Jane Eyre too. Jane Eyre finds in the end that she is the heir of her uncle. She is actually related to the people who take her in, and she goes back and she marries the owner of Thornfield, and becomes its owner in a sense, even though by then it's burnt down. But they've still got the land.
So looking at what's going on with popular stories today, so we've had with The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, Narnia being writ large and still in the films, even whether the current BBC Dracula is of the Gothic. But what the fantastic, which I picked up looking at some of your work, the fantastic and the grotesque, this fascination, vampires and all of this sort of broader genre that's taking place. What do you think's going on with that? The interest in that as a cultural moment.
I think it means different things at different cultural moments. I think our cultural moment is an interest in anything that questions the limits of the material. Because most people, as we were discussing earlier, most people claim not to have any religious belief and yet do not find it comfortable to live in a world defined by the purely material, because we import meaning. We import a deeper meaning to the people we meet, to the events in our own lives, to everything. And things like vampires question the limits of the material, while they also dramatize a kind of entrapment in the material. So to take Dracula, for instance, he's neither alive nor wholly dead. He lives in a kind of half-world that is not a transcendent, nor yet a material, and yet in some sense is an entrapment by the material. He's locked into this necessity to drink blood. He lives in a coffin half the time. And at the end of the novel, when he is freed from his vampirism by being sort of having a dagger in him, there is a look of peace on his face. So he is both a villain who is in some sense also a victim. And so I think he speaks to an unease with our own worldview, which people can't always articulate.
And dare I go there, but I will do. Harry Potter.
Yes.
That's just come to mind. What do you think's been going on with that?
Well, I've written an article about Harry Potter in relation to death and duality, where, J.K. Rowling actually said that she didn't reveal her own adherence to Christian ideas until the book was fully out. The series was fully out, because the last volume, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. In the end, Harry Potter eschews magic. He faces Voldemort, who cannot accept his own death, who represents that secular mindset. And Harry gives himself up to death and goes to King's Cross Station, this kind of limbo world where he forgives Dumbledore, who in a sense has bred him up to die, and goes back again to face Voldemort out of pure love. It's a very Christian narrative. J.K. Rowling says, sometimes she doubts, but she is a Christian, someone who worships as a Christian, I believe. And the story is about faith, hope, and love. And about a transcendent. And the magic is there to kind of defamiliarize our world, to make it strange.
Well, I'm glad I asked.
Sorry.
No, that's fascinating. So last sort of question here, if I can, I don't know if I'm shoehorning it, but with the fantastic and the grotesque, you wrote a book about Chesterton and Tolkien. Yes. Could you just give us a quick summary of what that work was about as a work itself, but more broadly, what you have? I think you have a wider interest around that, don't you?
I do. You'll be aware that I very carefully didn't say Harry Potter was a Christ figure.
Yes, you too.
Because what Chesterton and Tolkien tries to do is to show, particularly through looking at the influence of Chesterton on Tolkien, is that in Tolkien, for example, it's the form of what he writes, it's the style in which he writes, which itself, for me, does the theological work. So I'm trying to show that all sorts of literary tropes and styles and genres actually do the theology. Because when you read Tolkien, what gives you this sense of mystery and the transcendent is the way it's written. The way it's written with such detail, you can go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and you will never find the bottom. It makes you feel that the world it gives you is beautiful and transient and melancholy and does not fully explain itself and makes you feel that there's something beyond it. And of course, he then wrote, or he earlier wrote, the Silmarillion, which actually gives you a kind of theological backstory, which allows that work to give you a sense of the religious. And that's, for me, what is most important about the way that literature does theology. It does it by taking people into fictional worlds which provoke the sense of mystery and something beyond. Because in order, if you want to think about the world of evangelism, you first got to give people a sense that there is a depth to reality before you can go on to preach the specifics of the gospel.
I mean, that prompts me to think, so with I think it's the single biggest investment in the TV series Amazon are making for The Lord of the Rings. Yes. And they're going to dig in deeper into this world. So the Silmarillion, as I understand it, is source material, but that's always been a fascination with Tolkien. It's the establishment of the world behind the books that gives credence to its reality. And so there's this huge TV series about to happen and digging into that. So what is there anything else going on there, digging into that world, this desire to spend billions of dollars to excavate this rest of the literature from Tolkien as the backstory?
Well, Tolkien said he wanted to write a mythology for England. And it is true that it gives you myths and stories about people who are not perfect, people who are flawed, people who are in the end cannot save themselves. In a sense, evil destroys itself in The Lord of the Rings. Frodo gets to the top. He cannot give up the ring. It's had too much of an effect on him. And it's only because Gollum grabs it, bites it off and falls in that the ring is destroyed. So it gives you this sense of a world that cannot save itself. And yet these are stories that are nourishing stories that feed our imagination and our morality. For me, the original films were far too epic, far too sort of gung-ho, misplayed the battle scenes, did not give you the full truth of the death of the Nazgul and the Dark Lord by Eowyn and Merry. It didn't really play that in the way that Tolkien wrote it. And I hope that the television will have a slightly more domestic quality that allows it to feed people rather than feeling they're watching a load of heroes battling it out in a good versus evil.
Yes, wonderful. And again, inserting myself a little, so I came to faith when I was 17, but through my childhood from a working class, very alcoholic, abusive background. Yes. And the imagination in my environment was to aspire to a middle-class lifestyle that was emerging in post-Second World War. But for me, so the Chronicles of Narnia, I was captivated by. The power of it. I'm hearing some explanations or ways to elucidate my experience as a child. So I read the Chronicles of Narnia 7 books 7 times. I decided to read them. The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, they furnished something and sparked something in my imagination, even though they were fantastical, of a different way of life where I was living. Yes. So that when Christianity came to me, it's like, oh, this is what this has helped me comprehend and conceive. It was almost like my catechism behind the scenes.
You could use, people have, the Narnia stories would make. Think of the silver chair where he is locked in the chair and she says, there is no Narnia. That is what people are being told. They're being told there is nothing beyond. And you experience this for yourself. And you experience the value of yourself as a child, to make meaning, to have a role in creating a better world.
A little like you, I was very fearful as a child because of the environment I was in, but yet would read Bram Stoker and scare myself as I read it. But I think the thing I have a particular memory of is reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and you get to the point when Aslan dies. And given the environment of death and destruction that I was in, there was something there so profoundly different and translative and transformative. It did something to me, I think spiritually, that I couldn't articulate as a child, but saw a different way to deal with death and destruction. And it's always it's amazing. I don't understand how that happens in writing. I know that's your world, to distill something down so that a child could read that and it would open up this whole other world. If I use language today, it's like the bandwidth of that story is just almost infinite to open up other possibilities and realities. It's wonderful.
Yes, and there's a kind of freedom about it through making it strange, through it being a lion. And one of the most awful things is when the lion is shorn.
Oh, yes.
So, you know, he loses his beautiful mane. He is rendered this pathetic creature, and the way that the mice and, you know, the whole of nature is involved, there's a kind of freedom of movement for children reading that story, where they're not being bonked on the head, because Lewis can sometimes bonk people on the head with moralism, but somehow he allows that story to breathe. And for children, a particularly childlike response to the resurrection, where they dance around with, you know, they romp like small children do romp. And they really do that.
And I found it interesting, those illustrations.
Oh, yes.
Of that time. I know there have been ones subsequent.
The Pauline Baines.
Yes, the Pauline Baines ones. Probably because they're the ones I saw, but they brought to life what you were reading.
With a restraint, you know, they're not overdone. They're still within the genre of a children's story, another children's story that you might read. You know, they're not mythologized, or they're ordinary children. And there's something wonderful about that.
There is. Well, just to close this section off, if I can, there's a phrase you've used a few times about making things strange.
Yes.
Could you just unpack what does that mean, to make things strange, and what purpose does that serve? What does it do, enable us to do?
Well, that's what Chesterton does. Chesterton tells the story, which he gets from Charles Dickens, of Charles Dickens walking the streets of London at night, as he often did, and seeing some strange letters lit up over a doorway, Morifoc. What is that wonderful world of Morifoc? It seems something really exotic, strange. He has to go behind that door, and he does. And what does he turn around and see that he is inside? He is inside a coffee room, you know, like a tea shop, of which there were hundreds throughout London. But ever afterwards, Dickens said, he could never see those letters again, frontwards or backwards, and not get a frisson. The ordinary had been taken away from his conceptual grasp and restored to him with all its mystery and depth. And this is what Chesterton does. He does it in the Father Brown stories. Something happens, something inexplicable. A man is murdered and his body disappears from a locked room in a flat that's watched by several people. How could it happen? All the people begin to say, did the robots that he invented come to life and kill their master? All sorts of strange sort of theories come forward. And it ends up, what was the answer? Nobody went in the flat. Well, somebody did, but not somebody anybody counts. A postman with a sack takes it out. So, okay, the whole thing is explained, but no, the depth of the heart of that postman. Father Brown walked those hills with the murderer for many hours, and what they said to each other will never be known, says Chesterton. There, a depth opens up in reality, so you never see reality in its ordinariness again. And that's making strange, and I think that's what fantasy does. That's what Harry Potter does, as I said, the magic in Harry Potter. The Middle Earth is a making strange of our world. It's our world in some very distant time. So that we may receive it back as a divine gift. That's what I think fantasy does.
Sorry, you're causing my childhood imaginations to research. So Susan Hill,
yes,
and her books, would that be an example of that? I remember reading them and suddenly England is transformed.
Do you mean Susan Hill?
Do I mean Susan Hill?
You mean Susan Cooper.
Susan Cooper, yes.
The Dark is Rising.
The Dark is Rising.
Yes.
And I could never walk through
No.
a quintessential English town without looking for crows and other strange apparitions behind me.
That's another great
Yeah.
example. Alan Garner.
Alan Garner,
would
all
be
the weird
another,
stone of Bringsingham.
Absolutely.
Yes.
They are superlative stories. We're very good in this country of producing children's writers who give you this sense of realism. William Mayne would be another example. And yet something strange comes and the ordinary is made strange.
I could spend all afternoon asking you about that. So if we move on, could you tell me a little about we've touched on it, but your religious and then your academic, because they seem so intertwined, the journey through, you've done things like a PGCE and you've got this literature career and theology career. Could you just walk me through, the threads from where you were and then obviously pressing into education?
Well, I went to Cambridge, and at this point I really wanted to be, I felt a calling. And at those days, I could have been a parish worker or a deaconess. And my vicar said, "Don't do that, Alison. They'll just treat you like a doormat. You're too clever. Go away and study." So I went away and I studied and I did Part 1 English, and then I changed to theology because I wanted to do a doctorate on Spencer, the Edmund Spencer's Theories of the Eucharist. And I got my place and everybody expected great things of me. And in some sense they got great things, but I was they had no place for me in the exam room in Greek. They gave me a book of exams and I was flustered being put in the wrong room. I wasn't with the other people. I did the wrong exam and I was degraded. So I could not continue. It was a huge crisis in my life. Everything had been mapped out for me. I had to go and find a job because you couldn't do a PhD at Cambridge, even if I could have got the money with my degree. So I did a PGCE. I taught religious studies. I became children's editor for the Bible Reading Fellowship, education officer for the Mothers Union. And then I found my way back and was able to do a PhD somewhere else.
Do you think you would be doing what you're doing today without that, what must have been an awful experience when you went through it?
It was dreadful. And actually, if it happened at any other university, I could have complained. But it's still happening, I gather. Even to this day, people are still making these mistakes they have not learnt.
But these two worlds that that obviously you've managed to bring together academically, do you think that would that have happened for you if you hadn't had this?
I might have just become an ordinary academic. Who knows? Whereas I was doing my PhD all the way up to the birth of my first child, my daughter, and it was breastfeeding her at night and reciting, because I have it all off by heart, sort of evensong or having Compline next to me, and feeling close to other parents. Because that's what gave me a calling to priesthood. I felt so close to other mothers. I felt every child in the world was somehow mine as a result of parenting, that I felt this calling to priesthood at the same time as a calling to academic work. And so I've always felt that the two went together in some way.
Yes. So did you ever feel like you were a character in a Gothic novel at that point?
I think I did when I was younger. I think looking back, doing a PhD has always got something to do with your own biography, however hidden it may be. I think I also work on the Anglo-Irish Gothic, which is produced by Protestants. You know, so I think there was some synergy there between my own upbringing and finding myself in the world and the Gothic. I didn't feel quite so Gothic, you know, when I was happily married with a child, and I had a research fellowship very quickly, and, you know, I was working in a very Gothic place, mind you. I was working in the John Rylands Library in Deansgate, which is a great temple to knowledge built at the end of the Victorian period with stained glass of Dante, whom I was writing on. And I was allowed to go in the stacks and down in the bowels, read manuscripts, priceless volumes I could just read at my own desk. It was an amazing experience.
Did you go late at night?
I wasn't there that late at night. No, I don't think I would have been allowed. You know, they have kind of early manuscripts of the New Testament. They have, you know, Shakespeare, quartos, folios, what have you. I don't think they'd let anybody. In those days, they weren't even too sure about letting academics loose on the books, let alone letting them in the building at night.
So you've got this world of literature, imagination, the Gothic. You've got this sense of calling to the priestly, which is I'm hearing is catalysed as you become a mother, and then the theological, and obviously today they're writ large in your life. Could you just tell me a bit about how, from then where we were chronologically, those things have come together to get you to this point today?
Well, the PhD was on the Victorian Gothic, but it was looking at it in theological terms, and particularly towards a kind of Christian feminist reading, a very recuperative reading, which was quite unlike the other feminist readings around at the time. And then I worked on a book on Dante in the 19th century, where he was received in Britain as a theological thinker as well as a poet. So it has historiography, theology, painting, poetry, it's all there. So my academic career was bringing the two together. You couldn't be a woman priest then. I did work with the movement of the ordination women and gave little talks locally and things. We then moved to Cambridge, and I had another child, and I had a kind of mixed time doing college teaching. I had a temporary lectureship at one point. They also gave me my own lecture course even after that. In the English department, I did some teaching in the theology department. You know, I was sort of betwixt and between. I did follow through ordination. I got through, but then we moved to America. And then it proved that in America you have to serve your time in a parish as an ordinary layperson before the parish then discerns you. And I got all the way through that system, and then we moved back to England again. So it took me an awfully long while before I actually got ordained.
Gosh, so when was that? When were you finally ordained?
Goodness, I'm trying to remember what year it was now. I think it was 2007.
Oh, okay. So quite recently.
Or was it earlier? This is awful not being able to remember. But, you know, it took a long while.
It was a long... Oh.
I was jolly selected by the time I'd been selected. I'd been through 3 selection processes.
3?
I had to do another one when I got back because the first one was too long ago.
Oh, okay. So you had to sort of reset and do them all again?
I did it. There was a quicker version the third time round.
It was expedited. Good. So we've got... did you go to press now? Well, thank you for all that you've shared there, but into more specifically a couple of your works. Firstly, F.D. Maurice, and then another book that's a particular interest of mine to ask you about for the parish to finish. So I read your chapter on F.D. Maurice in Theology Reforming Society, Anglican Social Theology, that's the subtitle. And so Catholic social teaching was known to me from my own work and research, and I've heard that regularly. But I must admit, when I picked up got this book to read this chapter, my first thought was Anglican's social theology. I don't think I've ever heard of that as a corpus, but of course start reading the book and realise that until recently there's been no significant account or comprehensive account, as the book tries to make, of Anglican social.
Oh, there are various books, to be fair.
But the claim of the book is there hasn't been until the conferences that led to this book. Actually, the book uses the word a comprehensive account.
It's not as comprehensive because it's only one strand. It's so rich.
Yes.
You're right, there is no one. I mean, there are lots of studies, but there is the whole Guild Socialist tradition, which doesn't really come into that book particularly, and that is another strand. The book goes through very much the strand that leads to William Temple, but there is a slightly more radical strand that the book is less interested in. So I'm just trying to speak for the breadth of it, particularly because I come from the Anglo-Catholic movement. We don't forget Conrad Noel. We don't forget Stewart Headlam. Ken Leach.
My producer is cheering behind the scenes there. And obviously, because it's blindingly obvious, of course, Anglicans would have a rich, social theology, but just start to think of some of the characters and the people. So Anglican social theology, and it's how it emerged, other than for sort of top-down papal encyclical, more
it does emerge much more. It is the same, so that you do get a considered response. And I mean, I'm not an expert on church reports, but we don't really get the equivalent in church reports till very recently.
So if it's not church reports generating that, is it the nature of a kind of Anglicanism or inherent to Anglicanism historically that means, obviously there's cultural responses, 19th century and onwards. What do you see as all these people and places popping up for Anglican social theology?
Well, I think it's probably the parish system that until very recently you had a certain tenure, a freehold, and you were very much your own person. And so people are not, and bishops are also not always the most wildly radical of people. So everything tends to happen at parish level or groups of friends and associations. And that's how things happen. Are you with me?
Yes,
that's it.
I am.
It's not a top-down, it's very much grassroots
Yeah.
things, which sometimes people join together in the Christian Social Union or the Guild of St Matthew or all these other little... I used to belong to the Jubilee group when it existed, which is not the same as the Jubilee 2000 debt relief thing, is a socialist thing.
Could you describe a few more of those organisations and networks and relationships, sort of guild-like associations? That's what I'm hearing you.
Well, I've given you some of the key ones. There was the Christendom group as well. That was another one. But the Guild of St Matthew was one around Stewart Headlam. I can't remember what Conrad Noel's... I don't know that he actually had an organisation. It was more loose kind of people who used to come to Thaxted and do things. There was the Christian Social Union, which was a big umbrella group of people of different levels of radicalism. So G.K. Chesterton was in it, Scott-Holland was in it, but, other people like Conrad Noel might give talks. There are all these different informal groups. And then there are all the distributist groups. There's interplay between the Catholic Eric Gill circle and Anglican circles. Percy Dearmer's involved. There are all sorts of different kind of guilds and things. The Christendom Trust is around Maurice Reckitt and the Christendom movement. There is still a Christian socialist movement, including one in the House of Parliament. These things do still exist, but they usually tend to be very informal. They're not organised. There is the William Temple Foundation in Manchester, but they're not based in the church at all. They're more of a kind of academic
I know from my
thing.
own work, just broadly how guilds and associations for allowed relationship and Christian expression to the more pernicious forces that were emerging with economic flows going on through the 18th, 19th and 20th century, but never afforded the opportunity to look at Anglican social theology. So I want to bring this down to a very focused question for you about the NHS, well, welfare in general. And I think most people in Britain today, with a secular materialist background that's probably their hinterland, think that the welfare state was, just the product of a Labour government post Second World War, and not see this enormous wellspring and background of Anglican social practice and thinking that actually gives rise to, because I certainly read that in your chapter, didn't realise the significance of F.D. Morris for the notions of the welfare state that were emerging through the Second World War. And
they
no one knows
emerged
about
from the Malvern Conference and William Temple. It's as churchy as that.
I imagine it a sort of a series on Netflix, with some characters, showing us this story that's never been told.
Great characters. I mean, obviously, F.D. Morris is part of, they're called the Christian Socialists, this group with Charles Kingsley and the man who wrote Tom Brown's School Days and so on. But they weren't socialist as we understand it, though there will be socialists very soon, influenced by F.D. Morris, Christian socialists. But they were horrified by the conditions of the working class. They were highly involved in education and in this, the idea of this being as important as the vote. And after they were very involved in the Chartist movement and in supporting the Chartist movement in its aims, but saying that there must be wholesale changes in people as well as structures.
So the Chartist movement, again, my crude understanding, was it 5-6 key aims they were looking for? They're important things, aren't they, that we take for granted today?
Yes.
Voting, wasn't it, for the ordinary man?
Representation was the key one. And they worked with, and they had this whole kind of educational setup that Ruskin and all sorts of other people were involved in, and which still to some degree exists to this day, though it's gone through a number of changes. So they were the first, and F.D. Morris gave the writings that gave them the kind of theology that justified what they were doing, though it's also developed in sermons by Kingsley and so on.
I mean, there were so many, in the short chapter, realised how rich Morris was in terms of his life and practice and belief, these strands. And if I could just pick up a few of these to work through. So there is, you make this statement in the chapter, Morris's recovery of a dynamic and relational doctrine of the Trinity, wholly biblical in emphasis and offering a mode of communion with others through our mutual life in God, is surely the beginning of a true social theology. Could you just unpack that a little for me? It's such a rich, I mean, I know you do in the book, but for people listening and watching to this, why was that, what are you saying there, and why is that so important?
Well, it is at the heart of F.D. Morris's theology. He himself had been brought up a Unitarian. And so for him to come to Christian faith was to come to Trinitarian orthodoxy. And it is the relational, that the persons of the Trinity are relations, is crucial to him. And his understanding that this is reality and that we are made in the image of God as relational beings. And we find ourselves in the life of God, mediated through all our relations at every level of our lives, from those we love, our families, our friends, our work, and our nation. Though he did not have a nationalist kind of understanding of nation, but nation was our society, if you like, that we find ourselves within, with its own character. And he felt that every Christian tradition and every nation, in a sense of a kind of shared cultural imaginary, if you like, and system of practices, had its own way of revealing the nature of God as relational.
So something theological within that you pick up in the book, the often the separation between the immanent and the economic. And you talk about how important Morris is there. Could you just tell me, what, for the sake of the recording, why that's important?
Could you specify a bit more? Do you mean the immanent and the economic trinity?
Yes, immanent and the economic trinity, yes. For
But,
social relationships and God's participation in the world.
Yes,
You talk in the
I
book,
mean,
if I've understood it rightly.
I'm just writing at the moment an article about immanence and transcendence in nature, so I'm just trying to be very careful in my terminology, because he is very aware that God is immanent, if you like, within our relationships, and yet his immanence is always transcendent, in that Morris is very aware that we are creatures, and that creaturehood is the nature of our relation to God. So to acknowledge that God's transcendence is to recognise his immanence, if you like, in our creaturely relations. As we are analogically related to God, so all our relationships have that analogical character. I don't know if I'm really making it simple, but I'm doing my best.
Because you talk in passing, you make a sort of, you just pass over it quickly with regard to Fresh Expressions, which I know you pick up in for the parish. As I read it in the chapter, the danger of the mission of God being outside the world,
Yes.
and having to, the church has to then sort of invade and come into the world. But I understood, as I'm reading Morris, a very different conception of God's relationship to the world that you sketched it out there.
Yes, I was being very careful with my language, because I don't want to give you a modern social trinity.
Yes, that's what I was
That's
going
what
to
I'm
get
trying to avoid.
Yes, and how is this not a
We
modern
have to
social
be very
trinity?
careful that the Trinity is what we are being called into. It's not a kind of blueprint that you can apply in an abstract way and say, oh, look, we're being Trinitarian. That's what I'm trying to avoid in the way that I talk.
Oh, good. I'm glad, because I thought that's what I sort of understood in the reading, because, again, from my research interests, I've struggled with sort of usually practical theology PhDs that sort of, well, they do a thing that radical orthodoxy warns us, here are these relationships here, and I'll take the notion of the Trinity and just crassly, this is my interpretation, map that against that in terms of, I want to justify these social relationships here. Is that the space that we're talking about here that you're...
That's the thing I'm trying to avoid. So
how is it avoided?
How
with
is it
Morris?
avoided?
How do we avoid that?
We avoid it by seeing the Trinity as the real, and that we are called up into its life, but that we always exist only analogically. We keep that analogical.
That sounds key, isn't it?
It really is, because it is what makes God intimate to us. God is closer to me than I am to myself, says St. Augustine, because of my creaturehood, because I am not just an emanation, I am a creature. And so that distance is what makes the intimacy. And so Morris he wants to say that there is a kind of divine constitution, if you like, in creation as creation. But it is creation. And it's not
Distinct
easy.
from, but in
You can't just apply the Trinity to a particular kind of political system or anything like that. He does think that the family has a privileged Trinitarian character.
Yes, you did, because yes, I remember that in the chapter. Could you just unpack that a little? What's different about the family and its relationship to the social Trinity?
I really need to have Maurice in front of me here to make sure that I don't misdo. I mean, I don't know that I would go quite as far as he does, but he certainly feels that we are created, and of course he thinks we are created male and female, and there is a divine beauty in our complementarity, in our relationship, our erotic desire for each other, and that this naturally shows itself in children. And there is a God-givenness to this, and it is the nearest that we come to understanding in our own limited way the creativity of the divine. And for him there is, you know, it's not exactly a natural law argument, but it is a kind of understanding that this is, you know, we do in our shadowy way understand something of the divine parenthood and the divine childhood and the divine love between the Father and the Son, analogically.
So in that analogical, and I think you said something about participation in, you know, divine creativity. Is this the aspect of theosis that you also talk about in that chapter from Maurice? Again, I don't want to press you too hard on his work, but more, what's the place of theosis in that analogical? That's probably the question I put to you.
Well, it is the basis for it. Just as in any, you know, our difference from God is what calls us into relation.
For the sake of people listening, could you give me your definition of your understanding of theosis and why it's important?
It's sharing in the life of God as creatures. But as creatures we are called in baptism. And baptism, for Maurice, this is why I think he is really important, because of his strong theology of baptism. That in baptism we put on Christ, and we are revealed as what we truly are, which is God's children.
So more than incorporation into, there's a revealing? There
is a revealing. So for Maurice, creation, redemption and sanctification are all one movement. A very strong theology of creation is what characterises him. And so we lose a sense of who we are. We've forgotten who we truly are, and we need Christ to show us who we truly are and restore our relation with God. But that relation is never lost, it's just obscured. And so that's why he has such a strong theology of the nation, or of social relationships when they are generative and just and loving and good. They then share in the divine constitution.
So with all that, you mentioned Maurice's confidence in, not confidence, in creation and God's participation in creation. Is that what leads him to this, again, as I read it in your chapter, the claim that the world, I put a noted here, the world is the church without God. Yes. Church is the world restored to its relationship with God. I mean, I hit that and had to pause.
That's right. This comes out of his very strong Johannine theology. He loved the epistles and gospel of St. John. And the world, when John uses the world, he thinks of it as a world that sets itself against God and yet is called. God so loved the world that he gave his only beloved Son, Jesus Christ, that all who believe in him should not.
God so loved the church.
Yes. So in a sense, God loves the church. Yes. Because the world restored to God is the church.
Yes. So it's not that sort of, again, probably misunderstanding him, as I invoke him, Stanley House, you know, it's the church that makes the world the world. I mean, there's something very different here, isn't there? The church, the world is the church without God. There's a real confidence there, isn't there, of God's involvement and engagement in the world.
An amazing confidence, yes.
And that must mean enormous things for mission and engagement that will justify what he was doing and what he believed.
And it did have the most enormous effect on all sorts of people who made them, you mentioned Octavia Hill earlier and her work with housing, hugely important on the poet Tennyson, hugely important on many, many people, and on whole generations of Christians, Anglican Christians, particularly clergy, where he gave to people who were beginning to understand a Catholic understanding of the church, a more Catholic understanding of the church with a small c, as you might say, and a great desire to serve. And so you get the huge upswelling of priests who go out to the poorest parts of this country and of what was then the British Empire to serve the poorest, and an understanding of, them as already God's children who need to have that restored.
So if I'm understanding that, would that be more a conviction, we go out to discover how God is already at work in the world?
I don't think it's quite... Yes, God is at work in the world in justice, but an enormous confidence in the church as people who are organised and acknowledge and worship and have certain practices as the birthright and the home. So are wanting to bring together of the world and the church, but not probably, they do things. So, for example, St Mary Portsea I mentioned, St Mary Portsea goes out to evangelise. It goes out to provide almost like a welfare state for the poor in that area. It will do everything. It will have classes for young mothers. It will have things to help. It will have groups for men, it will provide drama groups, it will have funeral clubs, and it will build churches, daughter churches, so that so it doesn't really make a distinction between, it comes to be the church for those people in that place. And to, that's what it's doing, and it goes out to every part. But to recognise yourself as God's children means to be baptised and to engage in the communion, to participate, because the sacraments are so central. It's a sacramental theology. So it thinks, and by the time you get to William Temple, he actually adumbrates the world, everything as sacramental. It's taken very, very broadly, and that really comes from Morris in origin. But it's there in the practices as well.
So lastly on this, so what's I hesitate to use the phrase missional imperative after what we've said of the sending out and going. It's not a colonising or colonial instinct, but to take this, the church in the world as you described it just seems like there's this logical conclusion that to be the church here are all these rich things and participation, but how do you get from there to going over here to do that and be that? Does that question make any sense? Why would you go from here to there to be the church and do those things?
Well, you're not really going anywhere, if you know what I mean. You're just where you are.
That's what I'm trying to get at, yes.
Because sending, as I think I point out in my chapter on mission in the book, sending is not going somewhere that, when you talk about the sending of the Holy Spirit was there before. The Holy Spirit is just present and aware of the presence of the Spirit in a new way. It's kind of, we have to be very careful of the word mission.
I am, and I'm
which can be far too geographical a term, and obviously, the people who did this sort of thing, Cosmo Gordon Lang, for example, was involved in St Mary Portsea. You're there. You're God's church in that place, and you're there to uncover the kingdom of God in that place. And obviously anything that's going on that is just and loving and good is the work of God's Spirit. And you should jolly well join in with it. But it's true that in those days they were going to places where there were not organised, they were furnishing in a way that probably might not be the model today, a whole culture for people.
It reminds
Football clubs and all that kind of thing.
It reminds me of David Martin's Islands of Social Care,
absolutely.
Pentecostalism, which is my tradition, and of immigrant communities, and the church being the church, provides welfare and language training and care and education. It's just who they are and what they do, and these wonderful islands of social care coming here. So last map for the parish, which is closer to my own research interests, looking at I spent some time looking at ecclesial manifestations of two trajectories that if I can invoke your husband, as he's not here, of the post-church and an Anglo-Catholic rediscovery, an Anglo-Catholic turn. And was mortified that I came across your book after finishing my research. I wish I'd, it's one of those ones that you think, oh my goodness, how did I miss this? But I wanted to pick one key idea from that work, from my own mappings, my own theological mappings, and the separation of form and content, or more broadly, the relationship between form and content. Because my church tradition, which is broadly evangelical, has got into a bit of a pickle there of not understanding the relationship between form and content, and thinking that we can somehow have, as long as we have the right beliefs, as if you can keep beliefs separate from form, you can play around with the form and change it without affecting the content. It's like truth travels pristinely through the instantiation of the church to the present day, and we just use lights and smoke and mirrors and do things, and it actually doesn't matter as long as we've got this received propositional truth. And the manifestation of that, of doing forms of church to try to be culturally relevant and not realising the things that you're smuggling in as a result of that, because they're embedded in the very things that you're doing. And the danger of we talked about this before the recording today, of a sort of Christological heart failure, that by trying to separate Jesus from the form of the church, you actually end up losing something of Jesus in the process, because you're more enamoured with the form that you've taken on. So with that in mind, I came to your work, and we're reading this through, that we can't separate form and content in that way that many people have done, not just my tradition.
It's like a story. I mean, I said my approach to religion and literature was to look at the stylistics, because the meaning is as much in how you say something as what you say, in the clothes that you wear. I think we give the example, don't we, of a head teacher. If you want to be a head teacher with strong discipline, you don't go slouching around in a pair of jeans and think people are going to kind of pick up the message. That's a rather kind of negative one, but it's we're embodied meaning. There is meaning. If we believe in the incarnation, if we believe that there is a meaning in every physical manifestation of God's creation, then there are meanings in the things that we use, and we need to think them through. So, for example, I do that even when I'm doing Sunday school. So it was Christ the King, and it was Christ reigning from the cross was the idea. That was the gospel we had to do. So I had to think, how can I find a medium that will really embody that for the children? So I found scratch paper, which is black, but you scratch it, so in a sense you almost import pain to it, if you like, and it reveals rainbow colour behind. And similarly, what seems something really sad and negative, there is life coming from it. So the children, in what they did, they weren't just painting a picture or anything. I had thought through the form-content relation between the message and its medium. And I think we need to do that all the time. So sometimes I look at the kind of clip art people put up on their screens, and I think, is that what you want to say about the Holy Spirit? you've just taken some kind of sort of sentimental bit of guff and you've just put it up there. You haven't thought through, how is this image? What is this image telling me of God? How is the way this image was made? How is the kind of justice of how this image was produced to the people who sell it? All those kind of things have to be part of our thinking if we're going to use modern technology, for example. How is this medium being used? How is this medium being produced? What is the relation between the consumer and the producer, the image, and all this has to be thought.
Yes. And as you wrote that book, obviously you're addressing issues of fresh expressions and doing theological work for the Anglican Church and further reports that came later following up the original Fresh Expressions. But without pressing you too much on Fresh Expressions, I'm hearing that this is a concern for the Church broadly, all kinds of church.
For everything that we do. And I mean, I wasn't against any kind of mission activity. I think it's wonderful to get people together and knit, say. But then you need to think about the knitting and the imagery of knitting and begin to think through that. But on its own, just knitting and having a few prayers is not enough to be a church. It's an outworking of ecclesial activity for me. Church is about practices and traditions and scriptures and a kind of we are one, all sorts of things which are to do with mediation and practice and form and content in the end.
Well, this is exciting for me. I get to try something out with you out loud. Again, from my tradition, there is a very well-known book, I won't name it, but it sort of wants to suggest that this separation of the form of the church is so, free form that tells a story of, a guy who can't engage in church, so he starts, he's water skiing, and then they start reading the Bible together, and then this is church. I mean, that's a sort of archetypal, fresh expression around shared activities and interests as a homogeneous group. But I've always been convinced of it, surely the church is what happens when the water skiers, the knitters, the unemployed, people separate to their shared interests have a life in common in worship and practice around those interests. That's what I was reading again in your work. Those things are valid. I hear you say that, but they're not the church.
They're not enough to sustain an idea of the body of Christ. They're still keeping people, and of course they are very middle class. I would like to point this out. If you're poor, you're not kind of engaging in a lot of leisure activities. They are about you as an individual making choices, and in a sense what we want to undercut is the whole idea of what it means to be human. If we do believe in a kind of Trinitarian, we are called into a Trinitarian life, we're called into a life of love and self-giving and self-emptying. And that is one where we are, in Charles Taylor's term, we are porous. We're not embattled in our own little dodgem car. We give up that mode to embrace a deeper understanding of being human, where you become you and I become I in relation to God and each other. And it's too much I and my choices in a purely, sort of this kind of person sort of group. Not that there isn't a value in it, and not that there isn't, something good, but church should be at its best. That's what we are aiming for, is to be inclusive of every different kind of person. And we're not even thinking that's why we're there. And people that might not necessarily be your preferred option as a friend.
So you, again, invoking Charles Taylor, so this the buffered self, and I see that danger that we're constantly the self that we have in our societies today that we're familiar with is I get to pick and mix, and even worship becomes me making my meaning of God and who God is, whereas the notion of worship, I think, for the Christian is that we encounter God and realise that God is God and we are not. And then that's what that community is formed around together. You're nodding.
Yes, a community of reconciliation and mutual forgiveness. That's my kind of.
Yes. And that
With
can't
somebody
take place.
very strange doing something at the back.
And that can't take place around just a shared interest on
Not in the end. It's not sustainable over time. You need stronger connections, which are connections that go upwards. They're not horizontal ones where you bring in the upness. Are you with me? They are constitutive, woven in to this transcendence. So in a sense, we meet each other horizontally, vertically.
Yes. And that's where the analogical really is manifest, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, that's a wonderful place for us to finish that theological discursus. And some couple of big questions, but simple questions, if I may. Could you tell us about your responsibilities as a Canon Theologian? What does that involve? Sounds wonderful, but
it sounds very grand, doesn't it? Goodness me. Well, I'm based at the cathedral as a priest vicar. So I have a full-time job at the university where I'm head of department for my sins as well as professor. But at the cathedral, I'm responsible for adult education. So I run a theology group. I help organise conferences. We've got a big heritage lottery project to do with our leaf carvings and interpreting them in the modern world, particularly a kind of ecological kind of dimension. So I help organise conferences for that. I'm in charge of the libraries, being called on by the diocese when they want to come and give them theological advice and stuff like that. But I help out with everything. So I was talking about the children. I do my share of children's work. I help lead 2 enormous crib services for 700 at Christmas. I do all sorts of things. I do baptisms, marriages, I preach. Everything really, sort of an extra pair of hands. Yes. I get to do prayers at evensong this evening.
So it sounds like at this stage of life, those earlier, when we started, those streams of the literary calling to ministry, motherhood, theology are wonderfully manifest in your life.
They're brought together, and my new research project is about resources in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries for ecological thinking today. We tend to think, the scientific revolution was all about taking God away from nature, and I'm discovering an alternative tradition in natural philosophers, poets, botanists, all this kind of thing. So that helps bring all the Leaves Project stuff, which is all about ecology and sustainability, and my research together. That's what I'm trying to do at the moment. But it's a challenge being in a secular university, and theology and religious studies as a discipline is under great pressure.
How does that work day to day? You said it's a challenge. Can you delineate that for me a little?
Well, I'm having to teach students, most of whom are not religious, theology. Now, because I teach very often through cultural productions, through art or music or literature, there is a performative element when you're reading Dante's Inferno. Dante is an I in the text, and you, to understand the text, have to enter his thought world and perform the text. So in that sense, it's easier for me than it might be for my systematic theology colleagues, or having to get people involved in inter-Christian debates when they may not have that belief, and where we're not allowed to proselytize in any way. And obviously we do not.
But there's a sort of abductive experience for them with the performative, by the sounds of it.
That's what I hope, that without compromising in any way the way that I teach. I have actually written an article about it, what it's like as a personal tutor to have to be both an academic and a priest. It's a challenge.
Oh, it must be. So my last question for you, what do you believe is the biggest gap that needs to be filled in the experience of the average Christian worshipper, church worshipper?
I think there are two. I think educationally, in terms of Christian formation, we do not feed people enough. We don't give them enough to explore, enough to feed on from the riches of Christian belief. Art, music, literature, theology, everything, ethics, how to apply faith to their life. We just don't give them enough. That's the first. We don't allow them to ask enough questions, to do enough. The other is, I think we need to give them more sense of God's mystery and beauty so that there is space within worship. Sounds weird, you think that's what worship's all about, but to actually feel the mystery and attraction, because I know it's good to talk about God as your friend, God as love, but I fear that sometimes we make God too much of a cuddly toy today. And I want us to have a sense of his otherness, because I think only that will make faith real to us. Because it's really hard to be a Christian today and to think that it's real what you do, because everything outside just goes all against it. Really hard.
It does. I remember Miroslav Volf has been
Yeah.
inspiring to me, but also personally for my faith and the danger of reducing God, as he describes it, to Santa Claus who dispenses religious goods when we need them, or a kind uncle who ruffles our hair who says, "Oh, it doesn't matter." Yes. And that actually that's not sufficient for who God is, and secondly for actually understanding ourselves and who we are.
Our own mystery.
Our own mystery. There we go. Who we're supposed to be.
Because that's partly what I tend to do when I've got a baptism or something. I say, look at this little baby. How can you think that this little baby is just a load of atoms? Because nobody does when they've got a new baby. They think they come trailing clouds of glory. And they think, gosh, did I give birth to this? Brings me back to my priesthood starting in parenthood, where I feel closest to other people.
Well, what a lovely place for us to land, and if we'll finish there. So, thank you, Alison.
Thank you very much.
Excursus today, and it was wide-ranging and fascinating. Thank you for your time and all that you shared with us.
Lots to do.
We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.